Okay, it's the top of the hour. We're going to start with this webinar. I welcome you to the State of Cyber M&A edition. So this was inspired by the fact that every year I put together the Security Yearbook. This is the 2025 edition, which you can still get on Amazon. And I summarize what happened in the year before, and I've got a whole chapter on M&A where I basically list all of the deals that happened. So it's a record that makes it a security yearbook. It's a record of all the acquisitions that happened that year. And it is a record of all of the funding that occurs every year. So later in July, I'll have the State of Cyber Investment edition, and we'll go through the first half of the year. Right now, we're 2 weeks away from the first half being over. So I figured this is a good time to start talking about M&A that's gone on so far this year. But we're also going to start with a overview of the industry. So just to level set, this is how IT Harvest, this is how we classify and categorize the entire industry. And so far, I've found that every single vendor actually fits into these buckets. Um, Definitions are important, and IT Harvest and many analyst firms cover vendors only. Vendors represent, the state of the technology and state of spending on that technology. Of course, for every vendor, there's five or six, consultants out there, or value-added resellers, or distributors, or legal firms, or insurance companies. So the cybersecurity space is much bigger than the 4,380 vendors that we've found. But the 4,380 vendors are the core of it. Everybody else is feeding off of that, right? They're selling that, they're consulting using those products, or consulting on how to use those products. Um, and we have also been able to ingest 11,340 products from those vendors. So to date, the IT Harvest dashboard is the only database of all cybersecurity products. You can find them in one place. You can quickly search on them. When we started out, categorization was super important because it's the primary way to find competitors. So if you're an investor or an acquirer, you might want to be doing due diligence on somebody that you're looking at, a company that you're looking at, and see all their competitors. It's quite hard to understand who the competitors are when you talk to a vendor that you're investing in or acquiring, because they tend to not highlight the competitors that they lose deals to. They only talk about the ones that they win over. So it's nice to be able to quickly get a complete list of all competitors, even if it's a giant company. Palo Alto or Fortinet might have a tiny little product somewhere that's probably the biggest competitor to a startup's product if it does the same thing. Let's talk about categorization. Many, many ways to categorize. Every analyst firm does it slightly differently. I try and take a logical approach, which is the layered defense approach. So that means, network security, endpoint security, data security, identity security. Um, and then, of course, we add in other categories to fill that out. And GRC turns out is the biggest category, governance, risk, and compliance. A lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that every single geographic regime, be it the EU or a particular country, Philippines, Japan, have completely different governance, risk, and compliance requirements. So they might have companies, vendors that start up with products to help in that particular area. Data security is number two right now, and followed by identity. And a lot of people say, "Oh, identity is super hot right now," or "Data security is super hot." It's pretty much everything is super hot right now. We also cover MSSPs; those are the only service providers, services that we offer. Because if you think about it, they've really productized or they've servicized products and make those available to their customers. Operations is a fairly new area, but it's, basically all the tools that support the Security Operations Center, the SOC. And then we have to carve out separate categories for things like IoT security, because if IoT security just mirrors regular security. There's endpoint for IoT, there's network for IoT, there's application security for IoT, etc. Um, but it is a completely different buying center, which is one of the ways you identify market categories as who's the buyer. And definitely network and endpoint, almost 100% segregation in the enterprise between people who manage desktops and laptops, etc., and the people who manage the network. So that's a real clear break. Same with IoT or OT devices, usually separate management, separate buying centers, or buying it for different reasons. Threat intelligence is its own separate category. Been fairly static lately, though there have been some interesting acquisitions. Fraud prevention also completely separate. Usually e-commerce and banks and credit card agencies are the buyers of fraud prevention solutions. I've always said fraud prevention is the fastest way to liquidity if you're a startup founder. Create a new way to effectively prevent credential stuffing and all the other fraud techniques. And you will be, first of all, your product will be used and you'll grow very, very quickly. But then you'll also be acquired very quickly by either a large e-commerce company or, it could even be Amazon, but it could be MasterCard or Visa as well. And then the latest category we've added is AI security, and that's the whole realm, including security for AI. So, how do you protect the models from being compromised in some way? Guardrails. How do you keep your employees and your users from leaking your own data through these AI models? And then, of course, to me, the more interesting area is how do you apply AI to doing a better job at security? And that's a very, very hot area right now. So, just an overview of that defense in depth kind of methodology. Also, looking at the entire world, we have found security vendors in 94 countries. Quite a few countries that only have one or two. Iceland has two now. Malta also has two. But the USA, as always, leads in cybersecurity with just about half of all vendors based headquartered here in the US. Israel is number two, though could be challenged, and they've got 282. UK and Germany are obviously big countries as far as economic activity, and therefore also they have homegrown security companies to provide their needs. Much more rare for a German or British startup to move to the rest of the world, right? A British startup might move into Europe. Europe definitely will move into the UK, but very rare for them to target moving into the United States. Unlike Israel, whose their method of operation, standard operating procedure is, get funding, executives move to the United States, establish roots here, and grow in the biggest economy in the world. Now, you notice China's not in this in the top list here. I think I only cover about 34 Chinese cybersecurity vendors that sell to the rest of the world. China actually has 1,126 cybersecurity vendors, according to a researcher I follow on Substack. So I don't cover them because they use those who use both the book and the dashboard are not going to be buying products from Chinese companies generally, and are not going to be investing in or acquiring Chinese companies either. So, and then break it down by state within the United States. I put this together because there's always kind of, at least there used to be battles between the states and who's got the most cybersecurity companies. And it is definitely California. It's always been California, with New York a distant second. So California coming up on 800 vendors, New York with 200. That said, the second biggest concentration of cybersecurity vendors are in the Washington, D.C. area. That all came about after the federal government started getting interested in defending their own systems. So a lot of startups and a lot of spin-offs from defense contractors in Maryland, Virginia, Philadelphia, and of course DC itself. So let's look at the average age. So this was interesting because the very first time, and as a matter of fact, in this graph, you can see that the long tail here goes all the way out to 1763. I thought that was a glitch. Somebody had fat fingered inputting the founding date. But no, there's a company in Germany that started out as a printer equipment supplier. And the company stayed around and it just kept morphing and pivoting and eventually got into identity way back in the 70s and 80s and is still a large identity provider today. But that said, look forward to if you peg the start of the security industry, maybe about the time that McAfee and Network Associates and Quick Heal got started in the mid 90s, same time frame as Checkpoint got started, and start tracking it. Um, but if you look at what this is a graph of is all the companies that exist today and when they were founded. It's not a graph of how many companies are founded per year. So there may have been many, many more that got founded back in 1994, but they either went out of business or they got acquired and disappeared as standalone brands. So it's kind of interesting to track. Well, you can see the average age does come out to be about 12 years for the ones that are out there now. But then you look at, you say, oh my gosh, 2024 must have been a horrible year for startups. There are only about 40 that were founded last year. Well, that's only because it takes me about 2 years to discover vendors after they're founded. So there may easily have been closer to the 200. And I think that's probably the case, that there are 200 or so vendors founded every single year, maybe accelerating even. Very, very, that's one of the most difficult things to measure. Um, there are also about 10% of all vendors are acquired every year. Another 10% get funding every year. And then 5 to 6% go out of business without kind of telling us or explaining why. I think it's just like all startups. The founders, run out of money or can't get money and decide to move on. And it's one of the ways I tell that a company is no longer existent, even though the website's up and the LinkedIn page is up. But you go to look at the employees and you find the founders who are working at full-time jobs somewhere at a big company. So if you've been a founder, you know exactly what that experience is like. So, state of the cybersecurity industry today. I like to look at, because I've got a tool that I can do this with, I like to look at all the vendors that grew so far this year and all the vendors that shrunk. And this is growing and shrinking in headcount. So headcount is an extremely good proxy for the actual revenue sales growth of any company. The only thing that skews that is that they've had massive investment, right? So if Wiz or Sierra, which is both taken in over $1 billion, they can just keep growing forever, and it looks like they're growing successfully. We don't know that, right? We don't know until we actually get visibility into their real revenue numbers. But for the most part, especially after the last 2 or 3 years of cutting back and venture capitals, getting burned by Silicon Valley Bank, telling their portcos to stop spending money, that pretty much most companies are well managed and do not hire new people until they can justify the hiring. So that lines up their hiring that we can see on LinkedIn with their actual growth. So far this year, out of those 4,300, some 1,730 companies have grown. So anything over 0.1% growth uh, puts them in that category, whereas 30% have shrunk. And usually it's interesting because usually it's more the shrinking and growing are about the same number, somewhere around that 50%. So I think the industry is healthy right now. I think we've lost a lot of the companies that couldn't get new funding. They're going out of business, and so as expected, tough times weeds out the ones that aren't being successful. If you add up all of the funding so far this year, it comes to 7.8 billion. That includes the 530 million that Sierra announced yesterday. And if you do the math, that works out to about an $18 billion expected total investment in the industry so far this year. And the number of investments is tracking about um, even with what we've seen in the last year. So 122 investments. Now we'll probably end the year at, what is that, probably 270 total companies will have taken in new investment. Of course, it's hard to predict, right? We apparently are going to have the first cybersecurity IPO shortly here if Netscope goes to market. And if that happens, that'll probably increase interest in investing in cybersecurity, especially if it's a successful IPO. So, so often you hear the term consolidation when we're talking about M&A in the cybersecurity industry. And I am here to tell you the cybersecurity industry is completely different than all other technology and frankly, all industry. In that acquisitions are not part of a consolidation move. So, I'm talking to you from a town just north of Detroit, and within a 50-mile radius of me, over 100 years ago, there were 104 automotive companies. So, in Cadillac, Chevrolet, Pontiac Motors were all separate companies. So there was some M&A and consolidation and convergence to today, and there are two American and one European automotive company left here in Michigan. Same with hotels. If you look at the hotel chains, they went through massive consolidation, and now there's just about two or three major chains left, right? Um, and this is not what's happening in cybersecurity. I showed you the chart of how many are being founded every year. Um, and the reason why is that if Symantec and McAfee were kind of the trendsetters for how the industry works, they all came from the world of PC tools. And in that business, you do a lot of acquisitions, you manage these tools, and occasionally one of them just takes off. It becomes the thing that makes all of your money. And that's exactly what happened to Network Associates, which was McAfee and Symantec. And they realized antivirus was where it's at. So they built up their antivirus capability. But they never had all the best engineers in the world. And if you think about it, no matter how good your engineers are, creating a new product that is successful is the hardest part and the riskiest part of any business endeavor. And there's no way for the best of the best um, to actually be the ones that create that, with the exception of NVIDIA, right? Right now, NVIDIA is like just creating brand new stuff constantly. They really do have a concentration of the best engineers. But in cybersecurity, there are 660 subcategories that I track, and there are going to be experts and teams and funded companies, maybe five or six of them for every single new type of tool that can be created. One of those is going to win out. And what the big companies do is they just stand by and then they acquire the successful one, minimizing their risk that that product and the money they spend on it will be wasted. And right now, you just watch what's going on, and there's over 100 AI security companies, and there are some very, very early acquisitions going on of those when they still have, less than 50 people. Those are early and at giant multiples. So the companies like Palo Alto Networks are making huge bets right now on AI security. But it could very well be that there will be some funded AI security companies that grow very, very big, and maybe could be standalone down the road. We all kind of hope for that. So we took a look at the M&A activity for the last 4 years, and then we've got our projections for 2025. Every year, this is published in the Security Yearbook. So that's where these numbers came from, provided by America's Growth Capital, so which is a large investment bank, and they track all the M&A activity every year. And I republish it in Security Yearbook. So I went went through uh, the yearbook and looked at deals through June 12th today, right? So now we got an exact lineup. So, and you can see in 2021, year after COVID, and actually a very big year for investment and activity, there were 118 acquisitions, basically. And then 2022 was the biggest at 173. 2023 got to 137. Last year was a blip up from that, and 2025 to date is 137. So you can see it's tracking, it's comparable to the last 3 years. And of course, these numbers can vary widely because there's surges of acquisitions all the time. But it tells me the industry is healthy. We are not going to set a record for acquisitions this year, but we'll be right in that mid-range of the healthy years that we've been experiencing the last 3 years. So, and of course, you can see the total deals for each year, with 332 being the big year in 2022. And we're projecting 300 acquisitions this year, so only 10% off from the biggest year ever. And then I don't have data for this year yet. I haven't done the analysis on percent strategic versus financial. So strategic, of course, is when a big operating company buys a cybersecurity company to add to its own product line or enhance its security in some cases, and just sell through to their customers. And those are looked upon favorably by venture capitalists and founders, because if the word strategic is a clue, right? If it is strategic, then the risk is lower than a financial acquisitions from private equity or an investment group. And because they've got something to add, I'm going to use the word synergy, right? So the company you buy could help your own sales, plus you'll be able to sell their products through to your existing customers. Since the data from America's Growth Capital includes the numbers, I've added the bottom line for SPACs, special purpose acquisition corps. Um, if you track those, right, they've got a horrible reputation. But it's basically somebody issuing stock on the stock market, collecting a pot of money, and then going out and buying a company with that pot of money. And so that was way off last year, just down to one, which last time I looked, that one actually hadn't closed the deal that they announced the acquisition they were making. And I haven't identified any this year at all. So let's just look at that headcount data for some of the acquisitions that have occurred so far this year. Surrey Data was one that was acquired by Fortinet. And typically Fortinet is not a big buyer, big strategic buyer. They are very, very interested in intellectual property and buying patents for their patent portfolio, which they maintain as a defense, because Palo Alto has had some very, or not Palo Alto, Fortinet has had some very serious issues in the past with other vendors suing them. And the best defense against lawsuits for your products and your technology is to have your own pile of patents so you can countersue. And in this case, of course, I'm referring to the long-standing battle between Trend Micro and Fortinet. So Surrey Data is one of the handful of SaaS security product vendors out there. And look at this head count, it looks very bumpy, but that's only because it's small numbers. So if they lose 3 people, then you get a big drop off between 37 and 34. But pretty flat for the last 2 years, and then very flat at 37 as they probably were going through the sale procedure. And then immediately after Fortinet acquired them, you see that drop off in employees. Those are all the people that were able to find other jobs quickly, or they get hired by Fortinet directly, and then they immediately change their affiliation on LinkedIn. So you'll see that big drop. Hornet Security acquired by Proofpoint. This is a much better headcount graph. Obviously, uh, they were doing extremely well with really good, year-over-year growth, and steady growth, and probably commanded quite a multiple. When I look at these, I see, with that amount of healthy growth, and a strategic buyer like Proofpoint, that tells me this was probably a pretty good exit for everybody involved. Another one like that is Red Canary. We know this was good exit because Zscaler had to reveal the amount they paid for them, so it's just over $600 million. And you can see the company was growing uh, quite nicely when and Zscaler is getting into the MDR space. And of course, the biggest all-time acquisition is still ongoing and hadn't closed yet. But Google this year acquired Wiz for $32 billion. Like I said, the biggest acquisition in cybersecurity history. Probably not going to be matched for a really long time. Um, there aren't any other companies worth $32 billion other than Fortinet and Palo Alto and CrowdStrike. So, and those don't look like they're going to be acquired. So maybe the next one behind this is Cyera. So Cyera's just took in $530 million in funding at a $6 billion mark or valuation yesterday. So possibly they'll be the next. I personally think Cyera is going to go for an IPO. It's kind of like, nobody else has got $32 billion to buy an Israeli startup. So I think they should go for an IPO right when that window opens up. So that was my rundown on the state of cybersecurity in middle of June 2025. And stick around and come back in July, and we'll talk about the investment scenarios as well.